Good morning. This is Eric Miskell with EMS Now. Welcome to this edition of the EMS Now Up Close. Today I get to speak with David Schild again. David, of course, is the executive director for everybody's favorite association, the Printed Circuit Board Association of America. Welcome, David. How are you?
It's good to be here. It's always the three B's when we're together. Eric, bald, bearded, and beautiful.
Oh, I like that. I may have to steal that. Hey, listen, I was commenting before, you've been busy. I've been tracking you through LinkedIn and everything. My God, you're going to shows. I'll let you talk about those. You're touring member company sites. I
hmm
see you out at those. I mean, you're giving interviews, signing autographs. You're doing all the stuff that's needed.
Maybe only for my kids. It is really a very busy time. I think it's all happening in the context of this very distressing government shutdown, which, as we record this podcast, I'm hopeful is coming to an end, right? We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But, in the context of folks in Washington not doing anything, PCBAA is doing a lot. And you mentioned member facilities, and it really does speak to our growth, right? I do want to try to walk the line at all of our board shops, all of our test companies, all of our raw and refined material suppliers, certainly, all of our folks in the assembly community. And now we're close to 80 members, right? That's up from 5 when we started 4 years ago. And it includes some recent additions like Zentech, right, in Maryland, just a
Oh,
huge
yeah.
player in the EMS space. And most recently, Neros, which is a defense focused drone company out of El Segundo, California. So, we aren't just getting bigger, we are getting a lot more diverse. And we're adding a lot more of those red dots on the map, Eric, that are equal to political power. It's one of the reasons that our drive for membership is so aggressive right now.
Yeah. And talking about the shows, I saw you were at the PCB West. You were just at the AUVSI, however you pronounce it,
hmm
and those are important for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, PCB West is still, and the PCEA team does a great job with that show. It's still, I think, the preeminent gathering of board shops, of assembly shops,
Mhm.
and it was also good to be out there because so many of our members, Bay Area circuits, Technica, San Mina, are also in that greater San Francisco Bay Area. But as I walked through the show, it was great. When we started doing this 2 or 3 years ago, 2 or 300 booths at that show, I don't think we had any members. And now there's not, 4 or 5 booths that I can't go between before I see a friendly face, somebody who's on the team. And I think there is now a recognition that microelectronics outside of semiconductors, Eric, have some things they can do in Washington vis-a-vis what we call industrial policy, right? The
Mhm.
CHIPS Act was this monumental investment, but it went to some of the biggest companies in the world, and it was backed by organizations like SEMI and SIA. And so I think for more modest companies, right, for folks who are not in the S&P 500, there was
Mhm.
this view that, well, Washington does industrial policy for the big guys only. I don't think that's true, right? We have a SHIPS Act now focused on shipbuilding. We have subsidies of all kinds, and of course, the tariff regime in place. And so clearly, industrial policy is back in a big
Yeah.
way in Washington. And that's one of the things I was trying to say at PCB West is this train is moving in the right direction for our industry, and now is the time to get on it.
That was excellent because I was going to ask you to kind of give an update on where legislation is. Obviously, with the government shutdown, and hopefully the reopening, in a day or
Mm-hmm.
so. I'm not sure how quickly they turn that back on once they vote, but give us an update as to where as we're heading into the end of the year
Mm-hmm.
too, right? Where do
Sure.
things stand?
So I think there's two priorities right now. One obviously is continued support for HR 3597, which is the Protecting Circuit Boards and Substrates Act,
Yeah.
getting more sponsors for that bill on both sides of the aisle. Some really good names too. If you look at Raja Krishnamurthy, he is our Democratic co-lead on that bill.
Mhm.
Illinois, as you know, has a tremendous ecosystem of microelectronics manufacturing right outside Chicago. But it's not just where he's from, it's where he sits. He's the co-chair of the Select Committee on Competition with the Chinese Communist Party, which is very focused on our competition with China. And I think he's also probably the leading candidate to win the Democratic nomination for the senatorial seat being vacated by Dick Durbin. So, if he were to move up, if you want to say it that way, to
Yeah.
the United States Senate, we would have somebody who's familiar with our issues, who's a champion there. And of course, that brings us to our second big legislative priority, which is the Senate companion bill, right? We've
Mhm.
had very, very good meetings with folks like Todd Young from Indiana, Ruben Gallego from Arizona. And these are folks who have seen what industrial policy has done in their states. and they want to continue that momentum. So
Mhm.
what I'm really pushing for right now is a Senate bill being introduced, and then we'll have two pieces of legislation running in parallel. Now,
Mhm.
that's by no means the only thing happening in Washington, but that's sort of your legislative update.
Yeah. And concurrent with that, I noticed that there are also these other activities seem to be supportive of it. I noticed you posted something about what the FCC just recently did, right?
Yeah, federal agencies continue to signal that they really do care about domestic sourcing and trusted and secure supply chains. So there's a couple of things coming down the pike. First, you
Mhm.
saw the Federal Communications Commission saying we don't want entities controlled by China inside our telecommunications networks. And I think there's a misunderstanding that, well, we have this security frame called ITAR, and it makes sure that my F-35 and my Columbia class submarine won't have any parts from our largest global adversary inside that supply chain. But it doesn't extend to 5G telecommunications networks. It doesn't extend, as I was talking last week at AUVSI, about
Right.
autonomous systems. And so there are these sectors that I would define as critical national security sectors not covered by ITAR, where you can still have kind of the Wild West in terms of sourcing. I don't know where this comes from. I don't know where my supplier's supplier is building, assembling, shipping their product from. And that becomes, I think, from the federal government's perspective, a legitimate security threat. So the FCC has signaled they want some changes there. And they're not the only agency that's done that, right? I mean, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, I think they're all starting to look at their supply chains because, again, it seems like it was a lifetime ago. The COVID pandemic really did expose our dependency on global supply chains. No one's trying to undo the global economy, Eric, but I think we
Right.
are starting to ask tough questions about, are there things that we just shouldn't be reliant on
Yeah.
because they're, when they're made overseas? And there's scenarios where you have to worry about malicious actors and embedded threats, and those are very real. But then there's also just the very real problem of, what if there's a supply chain interruption? Right? What if another bridge falls into the river in Baltimore? What if there's another longshoreman strike at the ports? If I can't get what I want, and the technologies and the systems people are depending on
Mhm.
are basically at the end of this 7,000-mile chain, that's a lot of risk in systems where I can ill afford risk. So that's the conversation that we're trying to have. And I do think this administration, they have these dual poles, right? These dual objectives. And one is certainly an American manufacturing renaissance, and the
Mhm.
other is remaining globally competitive with China. And I think this really crosses into both those areas.
No, exactly. And that's also, as you said, the National Defense Authorization Act, right? They have that similar kind of movement that the FCC is now embarked on. So there already is a model for this type of activity.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the NDAA because we're coming up on a pretty important deadline. In 2021, the National Defense Authorization Act said that we've got to get dual use and commercial technologies that flow into the Pentagon free of microelectronics that are made in China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Now,
Mhm.
that might seem like an eternity ago, but here we are. It's almost 2026, and January 1st, 2027 is the implementation deadline for that rule. It's called Section 851, and everybody knows that it's out there. Now it's up for the Pentagon to write that rule, issue what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, where we all get to comment on the language of it. And then by January 1st, you've got to have a plan to get these technologies out of your dual use and commercial off the shelf supply chains. And those supply chains are everywhere inside the Pentagon. And so I think, we're here at an important moment that PCBAA fought for very hard in 2021. And now we've got to hold the Pentagon's feet to the fire and say, this is the rule that Congress directed. This is the rule you agreed to. Let's see it
Mhm.
actually implemented.
Yeah. Another thing I noted too, as far as activities, it's government's actually going out and meeting. I noticed the thing at TTM had who was
Yep.
the U.S. Department of Commerce and International Trade come out. Those are important events too to grow this.
Yeah, we say that our mission is to educate, advocate, and legislate, Eric. And the reason we start with educate is because you simply cannot assume that folks inside the government understand microelectronics manufacturing, understand PCBs, assemblies, substrates, raw and refined materials. They don't, and we shouldn't expect them to know this. They're not manufacturers by background in many cases. So I was really thrilled to see that the ITA team from Commerce was out visiting TTM. There is a much larger visit by that team planned for Southern California. There are studies underway to try to identify supply chain risk. Commerce under Secretary Lutnick and under Assistant Secretary Kreutz has been very aggressive about asking these questions. Where are we dependent on foreign sourcing? And of course, we put our hands up and said, we'd like to give you a tour of America's PCB industry. The 136 companies that are left, down from 2,200. And if you want to talk about an exodus driven overseas by foreign subsidies, this is a great place to start.
Yeah. Um, you mentioned before, kind of just touch on the whole tariff situation, remains a challenge
Mm-hmm.
as industry relies on that global supply chain, as you just said. How do you view this currently?
I think I've spoken to almost all of our members in the last month, and one of the things that I consistently hear is that the tariffs are being implemented, with a great goal that we share, an American manufacturing renaissance. I
Mhm.
think I would prefer to see them used with a scalpel and not a broadsword. And it's
Mhm.
the inputs, Eric, where we're getting tripped up, right? Because so many folks are saying, I understand if you want to tariff foreign made printed circuit boards, but if I want to run a printed circuit board factory here in America, there's certain tooling, there's certain equipment that I have to bring in from overseas. So you're kind of handicapping me with certain tariffs if a Japanese drill press or a German drill bit is much more expensive today than it was before because I need that in my board shop or my assembly shop. And so what we're trying to say to the government is we share your goal. We want more manufacturing in America. Let's be a little bit more selective. Let's talk about what exemptions might be available to allow these guys to make capital expenditures, build
Yeah.
out their lines, and produce what we all agree we want more of in the United States.
Yeah. You bring to mind when I was in India on my tour recently, I talked to them about this with the PCBs too, right? And they said, listen, we can buy the PCBs for X, but when we try to buy the materials to build the PCBs here, it's exponentially more expensive because that's just how China's doing their pricing, right? They
Mhm.
make it so that you have to buy the boards, right? It's more economical. I'm wondering how that might be here.
Well, I think, folks face a lot of similar challenges, right? Which is they want to do domestic sourcing, but so much of what they need from raw and refined materials to tooling and equipment has to be sourced overseas. Now, much of that is with allied countries, right?
Yeah.
But as we've seen, the tariff regime really doesn't discriminate between our friends and our allies right now. It's pretty much universal on overseas products. And you've seen some exemptions, right, for companies like Apple and General Motors.
Mhm.
And I think they have access to the White House and they have the ability to make arguments at a macroeconomic scale. What we need to do is just continue to keep educating and advocating and telling the government that, hey, there's a facility in Syracuse, New York, in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, in Ogden, Utah, that is trying to do what you're asking us to do. Let's talk about how we set the playing field in the most competitive way possible. And, Eric, tariffs are a stick, and we like to talk a lot about carrots and sticks, right? The carrot is a tax incentive. The carrot is a, demand side signal that says to the customer, you should bring your business to America and you should stay here for the long term.
Right. You mentioned before, and I wanted to follow up on it, the kind of the growth of the association. I noticed
Mm-hmm.
a growing list of congressmen signing up to support the cause legislation, right? I think, gosh, 4 or 5 just in the last month or so, I noticed being posted. So you've been very successful in that. It must seems to be building some good momentum there.
Yeah, our members have really stepped up in a big way. We have a letter writing effort underway, and nothing's more convincing on Capitol Hill than a constituent message. So, I have to say thank you to all of our members and their employees who have written letters to their members of Congress saying, "Hey, I work at a PCB shop, I work at an assembly shop, and I'm telling you,
Mm,
this bill would be a game changer for us."
yeah, yeah. I also note that you have a new board member from TTM came on board. That looks like a good voice to have helping to guide you moving forward.
Yeah, we're thrilled to welcome Dan Weber to the board. Dan has been a champion and an advocate for PCBAA from the very beginning.
Mhm.
And, he's moving into a more formal leadership role now. And our board, diverse, experienced, very solid and sober, and, is trying to sort of talk about what the next 5 to 10 years for the association will look like, not imagining, I think, any of them, right? When we started this thing almost 4 years ago now, that we would be as big as we are, as diverse as we are, in as many sectors as we are, or that we would have made this kind of progress across the government. So Dan's a great member of our team.
Yeah. And you mentioned obviously new members coming on board for the benefit of the audience. Maybe repeat who should be joining and who are the member companies that should be participating in your activity here.
Yeah. So look, we want to represent everybody outside of that semiconductor space who wants favorable policies in Washington for electronics manufacturing. And so when you talk about, why does a Zentech join the team? Why does Protech join the team? Why does Camden Copper join the team, right? They're all in very different spaces. Well, they're all part of that supply chain that brings printed circuit boards to life and into
Mhm.
those final products, up and including, OEMs, right? Why is Raytheon a member of
Mhm.
PCBAA? Because they know they can't move Javelin missiles, they can't move SPY-6 radars without complicated microelectronics. They need a reliable, trusted, and secure supply chain here in the United States. So what I would say is, if you are buying PCBs, if you are part of the PCB ecosystem, if you are selling PCBs or assemblies into a final customer, we are fighting for policies that would benefit you and your work here in America. And this is important, Eric, because it isn't as though the free and fair marketplace has led to the imbalance that we see. Every week, I read another story about a way that the Chinese economy is dominating a certain technology vertical. Last week, it was nuclear reactors. And boy, you get down to paragraph 4, and what does it say? Low cost government loans are the key to this dominance. It isn't a level playing field if American companies are losing to the Chinese government, which is what I really believe is happening. And so, what I
Mhm.
would say to anybody listening is, we want to get our government on your side, right? Blowing the wind into your sails so that now we actually are competing sort of nation state versus nation state. And this isn't rocket science. If you look at what's going on right now with the Thai government, the Malaysian government, they are rolling out the red carpet, excuse me, for American electronics manufacturers. And they're doing it because they see the opportunity as part of what's called the China Plus One strategy. So,
Right.
being on our team is a way to make your voice heard in Washington. It's a much better value, I think, for our member companies than opening up their own Washington office, their own communications section. It's a great shared services model from that perspective, but it puts you on a team that includes the biggest board shops, the biggest defense OEMs, the biggest supplier of raw and refined materials, right? In many cases, your key customers and suppliers, puts you all in one room, puts you all in one team.
Hmm. So we're heading into the end of the year, right? Holidays tend things tend to get slow, but at the same time, we've had this shutdown that's now opening. So I'm kind of curious, what might we be able to expect still before the end of the year?
Well, I think the biggest things that we're going to see going into the end of the year are at the Defense Department right now, right? You have seen this big announcement from Secretary Hegseth recently that the Department of War, right, is it? And I got to use the right terms here. Wants to reform its acquisition strategy. It wants to buy fast. And relevant to that on Capitol Hill, we still haven't passed the 2026 NDAA. And that's got some important provisions in it as well as to how the government's going to buy faster, acquire things at speed, at scale. So we're watching both the NDAA and Secretary Hegseth's announcement that they want to reform acquisition, because ultimately, if they're going to buy faster, if they want to make the defense supply chains look more like the commercial sector, that's going to show up, right, in the business plans for 2026 and beyond for assemblers, for PCB manufacturers, because of course, what's left in the United States is primarily focused on national defense. So, yeah, a lot could happen, I think, before the end of the year, most of it relevant to that five-sided building.
Yeah. But your activities continue because you have to. It's always impressed me over the years that we've been talking that you have to constantly be engaging and re-engaging with these people in Congress as they change, as roles change. We've had some announcements about people not
Sure.
not running again. People are retiring too. So that this is a ever moving kind of a tapestry for you.
Every 24 months we make new friends, right? And I think one of the things that we're focused on is, are there any key champions who are going to be stepping down or retiring? Obviously, when we started, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo from California, was a big champion of ours. She chose not to run in the last election, and now Mr. Liccardo represents that seat. He's been a champion as well. We are always trying to build a broader, more diverse base. The more
Mhm.
members of Congress you have representing, different states, representing different districts, the stronger position you're in. And I am proud that we can say New York, Texas, North Carolina, Utah, California, Illinois. This is not a regionally localized coalition by any means. But yeah, I've got 435 members in the House I've got to go educate and advocate and legislate in front of. I've got 100 people in the Senate. It is a long list. And Eric, I'd say this to all your listeners, it's a really competitive political environment in Washington. Boy, oh boy, is everybody and their brother coming in to ask for favors, to ask for favorable policies, to plead their case. And of course, that's what our Constitution does, right? Petition the government for a redress of grievances, right? It's right there in the First Amendment. It's really, really important. And so, I show up and the steel workers are there, medical device manufacturers are there, the Girl Scouts are there, the corn producers are there. We're
Yeah.
all trying to find favorable policies. And I don't mind that competition. We need to stand out. We stand out when we're bigger, when we're more diverse. And I also think we stand out because of what we do. We power modern life. You
Yeah.
just don't have any modern conveniences. You don't have any national security apparatus. You don't have any critical infrastructure without microelectronics and specifically PCBs and PCBAs. So we say that. And for many people in Congress, it's the first time they've heard it.
Yeah. Now, but listen, I think you guys have become a model organization, right? And or association, I should say, because we've been talking for several years now on a regular clip. And I've just, it's very cool to see how it has grown, like you said, from starting at 5 to almost 80 now, that hopefully keeps going. Yeah, I'm about to, as I said before we started talking, I'm about to head over to Productronica this week, right? And I'm going to be talking to engaging to people over there. They're fighting this, but
Sure.
they look to this, and I think what PCBAA has done is a really good model for them. Albeit the government situation is different over there. What they have to
Sure.
contend with is much more frustrating.
I get all kinds of inquiries from the UK, from Spain, from the
Yeah,
Dominican Republic, from Germany, because people do see this. And I
yeah,
think they look to what the US has done on industrial policy. And you could say, hey, the Biden administration did a certain approach. The Trump administration is doing a different approach. It's still industrial policy, right?
yeah.
It's still a goal of shaping the manufacturing community. And
Mhm.
again, I've got to go back to this. We are playing catch up on industrial policy. When I say we, I certainly mean everybody in North America and our European friends and allies as well, because 30, 40, 50 years ago, right, the folks over in Asia decided they wanted to own these verticals and they
Yeah,
made big strategic bets, right? Unfortunately, sometimes we think quarter to quarter,
yeah,
all right, and our global competition is thinking about their grandchildren owning
exactly.
certain technology verticals. So, we've got to make some strategic moves. And I think, again, the wind is in our sails. We're going in the right direction. We can't take our foot off the gas.
Yeah. No, I mean, kudos to you. I know that you've been a tireless advocate for all of this
Thank
out
you.
there, and yet you always smile when we come on. So, that's good.
Well,
I
look,
think,
I'm very, very lucky to represent men and women who make things in America that power modern life. I wouldn't have it any other way. It's a very cool story. I don't tell it as well with my political science background as the people who actually make the technology. That's why we do an annual meeting, right? Every year in DC, and we're scheduled for next June right now. We're going to be bringing a record number of executives to Capitol Hill saying, I run a factory, I produce a product, I make that airplane fly, I make it possible for that submarine to submerge. Nobody tells the story better than our members, Eric.
excellent, excellent. Well, listen, I don't know if I'm going to be able to speak to you before the end of the year. If something pops and there's a need, by all means, reach out. I
I
will be
appreciate
here.
it.
But if we don't, let's pick it up in the new year. And I wish you and your family happy holidays.
And safe travels and happy holidays to you as well. It's a busy time, but in the best possible way, I think.
Yeah,
Thank you.
exactly. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Bye bye.